SN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
And happy Monday. We are back on the Financial Survival Network. It means it's time for John Rubino of dollarcollapse.com. John, how are you?
Good, Kerry. How are you?
Doing good. Doing good. So looking at your homepage, I see you've got an article on welcome. Let's start again. Looking at your homepage on dollarcollapse.com, I see you've got an article which resonated with me because I'm in the process of writing one. Welcome to the Third World, Part 14, Homeowners Become Renters. And very timely, very true, because it seems from my knowledge and what I see happening here in Florida, Florida is kind of like the line in the sand, but I see many more houses coming on the market in Palm Beach County, and buyers cannot get mortgages. That's what's happening here.
Yeah. Well, last week there was this great housing report, at least on the surface. It was a huge increase in home building and what kind of would imply a nice recovery if you just looked at the headline number. But if you dig a little deeper, you see all the new building was in apartments, and virtually none of it was in single family houses, which implies that people are having trouble getting mortgages and houses aren't selling, and so builders aren't building new houses. And that's not generally a good sign for the economy in general, because that means that the housing sector, or individuals buying houses, which it used to be a key to the American dream, is actually flatlining. And so people aren't able to buy a house, and they're ending up having to rent. So you see a huge demand for apartments, and that's why there's so much building going on out there. So that's not a good sign for the economy in general, because that means the average individual can't scrape up a down payment and can't qualify for a mortgage, and that banks are tightening their lending standards at a time when interest rates are in theory falling, which should make mortgages more available. So just in general, it's not nearly as good as it looks, and it doesn't apply nearly as much positive growth going forward for the economy.
And what happened right after the first of the year, and I covered this with our mortgage expert, Karen Hankin, her last name eludes me, but basically the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, headed up by Richard Corduroy, if I mispronounce his name, forgive me, passed a number of new rules effective the first of the year. Number one was banks are now required to check a borrower's ability to repay, and that's a rather tricky test. But basically, when you apply for a mortgage, you've got to demonstrate that you've got 6 months mortgage payments in the bank. Never been done before, even before the housing boom and bust. So if your debt service, including taxes, insurance, is $2,000 a month, you got to have 12 grand in the bank. You got to have a safety cushion. You could argue that that's probably a good idea, but maybe you only need 3 months. Maybe you need a year. Who knows? Once you go down that path, maybe you should have 3 years worth. I don't know what the proper amount is. And I can tell you this, the government certainly doesn't know what the proper amount is, because they certainly don't need any cushion of debt service, because they can just print it up. Number two is you can't do credit repair after you've submitted a mortgage application. That kind of put the kibosh on a lot of people who they could be a few points short, 10 points, and sometimes it's just a matter of opening a new credit card or paying down a credit card where you have a little bit too much debt. That's out the window. Number three, which is a biggie, is that if you're putting less than 20% down on a mortgage, what's called a qualifying mortgage, the bank that's extending the mortgage has to keep a reserve of 5%, what's known as keeping skin in the game. And the net result of all of the rules that were passed by the CFPB is that, number one, it raised the cost of getting a mortgage from, because right now we see that that the 10-year is at 2.5%. So really, cost of a 30-year mortgage should be under 4%, according to what the rules were before the first of the year. And number two, it's made it extremely hard for most people to get a mortgage. And you're seeing this in the number of applications, mortgage applications filed, and you're seeing the result of this in home sales. And you know what's going to happen next, don't you, John?
What, Kerry?
You are going to see panic by the administration because they want you to believe that everything's fine, the economy is doing great, and we're in a recovery. So you know what they're going to do, don't you?
I think they're going to fudge some numbers and flood the system with new cash pretty soon to try to fix their past mistakes. What do you think?
Well, I don't think they were necessarily mistakes. It's probably sound economics being brought to the system. But yeah, they're going to go back on all those rules, and they are going to flood the system. And, if you have a pulse, you'll get a mortgage. And if you have a job and reasonably okay credit, they'll just go back and, get rid of those rules rather than letting the market take care of all this. And you and I are big free market guys. And you and I believe that if they had just allowed the free market to behave and not given the banks the ability to create money printed up out of thin air, right, we would have never been in this situation, would we have?
Well, yeah. I mean, when we talk about mistakes that they're trying to fix now with ever more extreme measures, you have to go back to the original intervention in the housing market by the federal government with the creation of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are basically entities that buy mortgages from banks and then give banks cash with which to make more mortgages. And the idea is that...
and no risk, right?
Yeah.
Take no risk.
It was literally no risk. If you're a bank and you originate a mortgage and then you sell it to somebody else for securitization, you're completely off the hook for that decision. And exactly. The way it used to work is that if you were a banker and you were making loans to people, you had to hold that loan for the duration because, who would want to buy a car loan or a mortgage from you? So you had to
be out of your mind.
Yeah. You had to make a good decision. You had to lend money to somebody who could definitely pay it back, or you would be on the hook for that loss. And that made you be very careful about the loans that you made as a banker. And so loans were necessarily harder to get because somebody had to really prove that they were going to be able to pay it off. And so you had debt being taken on for only productive uses, or mostly only productive uses. And when the government got involved in order to make it easier for people to borrow money, they necessarily changed the system in a way that made worse and worse quality loans be created. And so, bankers can now, in a world of securitization, where you make loans and then you just sell them to somebody else for packaging into bonds, bankers can basically make loans to anybody and get away with it. And so they don't have the pressure that they used to have to make good loans. And that's why people are so deeply in debt. You've got subprime car loans being one of the biggest growth markets out there now. And as you said, when the housing market slows down, as it looks like it's going to, banks via government pressure are going to lower their lending standards for mortgages, and we'll see a bunch of subprime mortgages getting written again. And you could make the case that none of this should be happening because the government should just not be involved in this market. If the government wasn't subsidizing mortgages, then you would see fewer mortgages getting written, and the ones that do get written would be with good down payments to people that have money in the bank and can definitely make the payments going forward. So it would be harder to buy a house, but once you buy a house, you wouldn't be in a situation where you're living paycheck to paycheck just to cover your mortgage, and a leaky roof will throw you out on the street, which is the situation that a lot of people found themselves in after the housing bubble in the first half of the previous decade. So we don't want to go back to that again, but we might end up having to because the government is going to see no alternative if it wants the economy to grow. And so we're in a situation where we borrowed too much money back back in headier times. And now we're doing more and more extreme things in order to prevent those past mistakes from coming back to bite us. And there's no way out of this. The debt has been taken on. It has to be wiped out somehow. Either it has to be paid off or defaulted upon. And the government is going to do whatever it takes to keep those defaults from happening. And that's why we'll see rising volatility, more and more crazy policies coming out of Washington going forward until the system spins out of control. And it's really just a question of when, not if.
Oh, it's going to happen. There isn't a question about it, John. I mean, they're doing it. Just the other day, the head of the entity that supervises Fannie and Freddie has already rolled back the risk rules for banks. It's happening, There's no question about it. And it's going to continue to happen because, whatever they do now that makes it easier for people to get mortgages isn't going to blow up for a couple of 2-3 years until the next guy in the White House is in the White House. And then he or she will have to deal with it. Could very well be a she. And hey, that's somebody else's problem, right?
Yeah. And it'll be all of our problems when it happens, because housing is just such a broad-based sector. If tech stocks tank or something like that has happened in 2000, when the tech bubble burst, that's bad for people who own a lot of tech stocks, but not that big a deal for most people. But when housing gets into trouble, that affects everybody because most of us are homeowners or we're connected to the housing industry in some other way. And so for us to create another housing bubble as a matter of public policy in order to keep the economy growing is just crazy. And yet that's one of the few levers that the government feels like it still has, one of the few tools. So of course they'll go for it. Of course they'll give it a try. And because remember where we are, we're 5 years into a recovery right now, which is usually when cyclical sectors like housing start to overheat. But instead, you're seeing the opposite. Single family homes are flatlining. And the government sees this and understands that you can't have a robust economy in which lots of new jobs are being created and people are making them enough money to pay off their debts, and you reach economic escape velocity where you don't need government help anymore. That's their goal. Well, you can't have that if housing is actually heading in the other direction. So without a doubt, if this continues, if the trend continues in housing, you'll see some really crazy public policy initiatives aimed at pumping up the housing market, without regard to the fact that the average household is already deeply in debt, and there are already too many houses out there because we built so many in the previous housing bubble. None of that's going to matter. They just need that number to be growing. And so we'll see them doing whatever it takes. And as you said, they'll insist that banks make ever riskier loans and assume that taxpayers will bear the consequences of any problems, and that their successors, the successors to today's politicians, will be the ones who have to deal with it, because they want to get that number up now, heading into the next election, and they'll do whatever it takes. So, it's this way in almost every sector of the economy right now. You're seeing government intervention to manipulate markets and try to get us through the next election without turmoil. And that's as far as the planning goes. It's not like there's some kind of deep theory here where if you do this, then this happens, and then the next consequence is a return to normalcy of steady growth and low debt and things like that. There's nothing like that in the planning of government intervention in the markets right now. It's all about the next month or the next election cycle. They just want to keep things from blowing up as long as possible in order to complete their terms in office, retire with a nice pension and a lot of status, and then let the next guy worry about what happens. So, as Keynes, as Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. And as the Austrian economics rejoinder to that goes, well, we're living in Keynes's long term. He's dead, but we're here. Yeah. and so, that's where we'll be 5 years from now, in the long term of the guys who we're not worrying about the long term today.
Exactly right. And, the economy is toast. And hey, more on this when we return on the Financial Survival Network.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next.
Urgent alert. ex-Secret Service agent claims it's worse than people know. One of Obama's former Secret Service agents recently smelled a rat. What he discovered inside our government was so devastating, he only saw one option. He quit. What's worse, he fears what he found could affect your job, your neighborhood, and most importantly, your family, very soon. It's worse than people know, he said in a recent interview, and I'm not trying to scare you either. We too share his concerns. This is why we've devoted the better part of 3 years collecting solutions for nearly all problems created by intrusive governments, and we've succeeded. Go to hiddensecrets1.info to check out all the details. Our panel of insiders have devised a legal but sneaky set of solutions to help you reclaim your privacy from the NSA, opt out of Obamacare, and make a bundle from little-known investments and small business opportunities. Simply visit hiddensecrets1.info. That's Hidden Secrets, the number 1.info.
The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
And we are back on the Financial Survival Network. We got John Rubino of dollarcollapse.com. And John, this is what the money bubble is all about, right?
It is. The Money Bubble, the book that James Turk and I released in January, is about the fact that the real financial bubble, the real distortion, is in fiat currencies. Since 1971, the major governments of the world have basically had unlimited printing presses that they could use to just create as much new currency as they wanted to. And on that stage, all these smaller financial bubbles like tech stocks and junk bonds and housing have blown up and then crashed. And new ones are coming. We're doing our best to blow up new bubbles, but it's all happening on the stage of fiat currencies increasing in supply all around the world at a rate that's completely unsustainable. And when that bubble bursts, it's game over. So the question is, can we blow up another financial bubble to get us through the next couple of years, or are we out of ammunition? Is it now impossible to have another tech stock bubble or another housing bubble or whatever else comes next? And I would argue that we're pretty close to the end of the process. Maybe we can have one more asset price bubble, which we're on the verge of in a lot of areas. High-end real estate is through the roof, and fine art is through the roof, and equities are at record levels all around the world. So you could argue that we are at the tail end of yet another bubble that will burst and cause financial turmoil. But I think that we're very close to the end of the process. And so this housing being really hard to pump up is one sign of it, and stocks kind of topping out here is another. And it goes on and on. The signs of weakness, like the Eurozone dropping into a recession, which is leading to deflation, and China's credit bubble blowing up. There are a lot of signs of a topping right now.
Yeah, but you never thought that they could do it again, though. I mean, after 2008, did you really think it could be done? I just never believed they could do it.
Well, the numbers back then were just really daunting. The U.S. already had total debt that was 350% of GDP, and that's not counting twice that in unfunded liabilities in Medicare and Social Security. So you would have thought in 2008, 2009, that the system had grown completely unstable and was going to crash. At least I thought so. And yet they managed to keep it together by taking on even more debt and creating even more currency. But there's a limit to this. The numbers don't lie. And if you borrow more than you can pay off, then something else has to happen. If you can't pay it off, you have to get rid of that debt somehow. And clearly the world's governments, especially Japan, and right after them, the U.S., and then comes Europe. These governments are so deeply in debt, or these countries are so deeply in debt, that they can't finance their debts from cash flow. So something has to happen, and either it's you lower the value of the currency dramatically, or you default on a bunch of this debt. So we're at the point where one or the other is going to happen in the coming decade. And we're pursuing policies for the former, the aggressive depreciation of the world's major fiat currencies. And so the question becomes, can they pull it off? Can you do that without blowing up the bond market and causing a financial crash that wipes out all this debt through default? I don't know. We've never been here before, but
it's find
clear
out.
that one or the other. Yeah, we're going to find out pretty soon. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just amazing that they've pulled it off for as long as they have. And, it just is incredible. Like you say, we've never lived through any point in time like this before. Yeah. And, it just goes back and forth. You look at the exchange rates, the dollar's up, the dollar's down. Right now, as we speak, the dollar index has gone below 80 again. It's May 19th, 2014. The dollar's been up over 80. Now it's down below 80 today. And oil's right around that $100. It's at 103 almost. And you wonder, how do they pull it together? How do they keep it going? And yet they do, right?
Well, I think that's the really interesting theoretical question about today's world is how the heck can governments of the world with this kind of debt continue to function? And I think the answer in general terms is that a printing press is a phenomenal tool for fooling people because it allows you to manipulate all kinds of markets with newly created currency and make the world look better than it is, and to force down interest rates the way they've been doing causes people to think that the system is actually fairly healthy because low interest rates are usually a sign of relative health in the sense that if you can borrow money for 3% for 15 years on a mortgage, that makes you feel like you're creditworthy. Yeah. And the banks must know whether you're creditworthy or not because they're the experts. And if they're willing to give you this money, then things must be okay. You must be doing all right. And same thing with car loans. If somebody's willing to lend you $40,000 to buy a new BMW, then you must be okay.
Right. They ought to know. They're the experts, right?
Exactly. And so
I guess I'm okay.
So by manipulating interest rates, the government fools everybody else into thinking things are basically all right. And same thing with the stock market. Yeah. By manipulating equity prices higher, they make everybody feel smart who have equities. Everybody who bought an equity mutual fund in the last few years thinks they're smart and thinks they're getting richer. Mm-hmm. And so they're more likely to go out and buy other stuff with those paper profits. And that's called the wealth effect. And that's the holy grail of today's government monetary policy. They want to convince us that we're richer because our asset prices have gone up. And in that way, get us to go to Walmart or Sears or wherever we shop and buy a bunch of stuff, which then causes those companies to report higher earnings and hire more people. And then you get the economy growing. And then at some point, in theory, you reach escape velocity where the government isn't needed anymore because everybody's borrowing a lot of money and buying stuff and stores are hiring people. And of course, that's not happening. Main Street is not healthy, whereas Wall Street is very healthy.
When we come back, let's talk about your story, Amazingly Deceptive Headlines, Part 1.
That is a great story, yeah.
On the Financial Survival Network.
FSN Radio.
When your accountant wants tax-free income, this is what he does. Accountants know the law. They also know that any American could legally get paid up to 3 times per month, 100% tax-free. That's 36 tax-free checks each year. It doesn't matter what you make already. This simple strategy could work for anyone. Go to www.irsrevenge2.com to learn how. That's irsrevenge2.com.
The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
And we are back on the Financial Survival Network. We're talking with John Rubino, Amazingly Deceptive Headlines, Part 1. So how do you fool all the people all the time, John? Well, when you control the media, or most of it, 99% of it, other than those fringe kooks like you and I, it's easy, right?
Besides manipulating the financial markets, it really appears that the media is complicit in all of this. Because if you're a reporter or an editor, you have a lot of power to shape people's perception of the news by just deciding, who to quote first in an article or how to slant an article or what kind of a headline to write. And a great example of this showed up lately in Bloomberg, where they had an article titled, excuse me, it was Associated Press, not Bloomberg, but the title was "Foreign Holdings of U.S. Treasury Debt Hits Record." Now, the implication of that headline is that the rest of the world wants dollars. They think we're a good credit, they want to buy our debt, and they want to invest in the U.S. or lend us money at least. But if you dig a little deeper, you find out that all that borrowing or all that buying was coming from Belgium, of all places. China and Japan were actually decreasing the amount of treasuries that they were holding, and Russia had dumped something like 1/5 of its U.S. treasuries on the open market. Meanwhile, Belgium had bought about $200 billion of our debt in the last year to go from $188 billion to about $381 billion. And Belgium is like 10 million people. It's a little tiny country.
It's a speck.
But it's also the capital of the Eurozone, of the European Union. And so for them to be aggressively borrowing or buying our treasury debt at the same time that we're supposed to be tapering, the U.S. is supposed to be buying less and less of its own debt. And one of the question marks about the last few months is how we could be, buying less and less of our debt back and therefore putting less downward pressure on interest rates and have interest rates fall during that time. Interest rates were supposed to rise when we tapered. And that was the big risk in the process, that would rising interest rates in the U.S. blow out our budget deficit and cause other kinds of distortions, which actually hurt more than it helped. And that it hasn't happened was something that people were wondering about. Well, now we know is that Belgium has been buying all our debt for us. Yeah. And so the question is, was there some kind of an under-the-table deal cut in which the Eurozone agreed to buy a whole bunch of our debt in return for us doing something else for them or whatever? Is there a secret manipulation going on of the treasury markets and the by implication, the currency markets, and that we're not being told about? So in that Associated Press article, you would think if the reporter was paying attention, that would have been the question in the headline. Why is Belgium buying so much of the U.S.'s debt? And instead, they just say, well, foreign holdings have hit a record, which is a completely different story. And you would think that the media, if it was actually adversarial like it used to be, in other words, wanting to get at the truth and not just taking what they get in press releases from the government and reprinting them, you would think that the media would be on top of this, but they're not. You would think. And so the question that arises from that then is this happening because the media is ignorant? Are they just hiring beginning reporters and editors who really don't understand the issues and therefore who just
people that flunked out of J school, right?
Yeah.
You flunked. You're perfectly qualified.
Associated Press.
Yeah. Hey, you're hired. You are hired. You're perfectly qualified.
And see, that's a question that shows up in almost any kind of analysis of the world today is, are these guys ignorant or are they corrupt? And you look at the government, you have to ask that question.
Corrupt.
Or the big banks, all of these guys, they're behaving in ways that can only be explained by one of those two options, right? Because they can't be competent and honest and behave like this. It would make no sense.
Yeah, they got much better grades than I did in college. I assure you of that. They made the dean's list every semester. They got much better SAT scores than I did. Promise, and yet they are incapable of the most basic form of journalistic curiosity here, unable to scratch the surface. So obviously they've got some heavy student loans that need to be paid back and very scared of losing that job and being blackballed from the profession, right?
Well, that's one very reasonable explanation. These guys can't afford to lose their jobs. And really, it is true in journalism. If you lose a job, where are you going to go? Nobody else is hiring.
You're going to have a blog that nobody reads.
Exactly.
Like the Financial Survival Network. 3,000 people a day go there and you're stuck. That's it.
Well, Kerry, so you got in while the getting was good. So you built yourself a little empire there. But the guy who follows you is going to bump up against the Financial Survival Network. Yeah,
I'll hire him, but I'm not going to pay him much.
What he made at Bloomberg or Associated Press?
He will immediately go into default on his student loans. I promise you that. So you can understand. I mean, you can have a little bit of sympathy for a reporter or an editor who has to toe the corporate line and has to slant stories to the benefit of the guys who are writing his paychecks. I get that. Mm-hmm. But
at the same time, it's a perversion of the usual function of a free media, which is to ferret out the truth and to hold the people in charge to account. And that's not happening means that we're kind of on our own as individuals. We can't trust what we're reading anymore, at least from the mainstream media, and at least in the headlines of these stories.
If we ever could.
Stories, some of these stories, the headline says one thing, and then the data that's presented in the story says something completely different. So you can still get the truth by reading the story closely. But if you just glance at the headlines, you get a completely different story. And I think that's what most people do. I mean, regular people are busy. They don't have time to read 20 different news stories on a given subject and then come to an informed conclusion. They glance at some headlines, and then they get back to their real life. And so it's yet another example of the printing press's ability to pervert the truth and to fool us.
Yeah.
And the solution, obviously, is for the average person to really read deeply and not take what they see at face value. And to the extent that a few people are doing that, then you get a very vibrant sound money community out there. It's small, but it's growing in understanding. The gold bug community always got this. And then the people who are kind of coming to this a little bit later, but starting to figure it out, they're really encouraging because they do seem to be getting it, and they are skeptical of the company line in the mainstream media. And so that's a sign for hope of the future.
Yeah, and understand it's not a Republican Democrat thing here at all. It's got nothing to do with that. It's a system versus outside the system thing, right? It's nothing to do with politics.
No, I mean,
whatsoever.
The two major parties basically are fed by the same income stream. Wall Street is the biggest campaign contributor to both the major Republican and major Democrat politicians. And so it's not a surprise that whoever gets into office is going to push banking-friendly laws and refrain from prosecuting specific people within the banking industry.
Exactly.
It's something like, I think somebody from a major bank just went to prison lately. And he was the first guy.
Did he?
After all these crimes, I saw, it was somebody I hadn't heard of, but I saw on TV that there were, I think it was Jon Stewart, which is actually one of the few sources of honest journalism out there, even though it's got he has a perspective and he has a point of view, but he's still pointing out the absurdity of both the right and the left. And one person from Occupy Wall Street has gone to prison, and one person from the major banks have gone to prison. And that's it. And the crimes that were committed in the housing bubble and the aftermath of the housing bubble were way more extensive than what happened during the savings and loan crisis of 1990, circa 1990.
Yeah.
And yet something like 800 S&L executives were prosecuted and sent to prison in the aftermath of that crisis.
Yeah.
And this is orders of magnitude bigger, the crimes that were committed by Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase and Merrill Lynch and Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns. And yet not one of those guys went to prison. So what that means is that the government has basically been captured by that industry. So they can get away with almost anything. And the worst thing that happens to them is that they pay a fine that is a fraction of the profit that they made from the criminal activity. And it's still ongoing. LIBOR was manipulated for years and years. Gold has, it's now coming out, been manipulated for years. And foreign exchange markets. Yeah.
I'm shocked. There's gambling.
Yeah.
There's gambling going on. Can't believe it. Well, on that note, dollarcollapse.com. Don't forget, buy John and James Turk's book, The Money Bubble, and go to our site, financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Sign up for the newsletter. We've got some really great developments going on. And we will be publishing an article on this insane dichotomy. On the one hand, we will have a government that wants an honest housing market, although not necessarily free market housing. We don't want that. But on the other hand, we want a government that wants easy money to keep this market going, because it's bad politics to have a market in the crapper. And just like Milton Friedman said, government that is working at cross purposes and inevitably the people will pay for it. Right, John? So next week, same time, we'll talk to you then. Be well.
Thanks, Kerry. You too.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.